The twin suns hung low in the crimson sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the sprawling marketplace of Decalon, a remote desert planet known more for its lawlessness than its beauty. The air was thick with dust and the scent of exotic spices, mingling with the acrid smell of sweat and desperation. The marketplace was a chaotic blend of life forms from every corner of the galaxy, traders, mercenaries, and drifters, all converging in this harsh, unforgiving environment to barter for goods, information, or, in some cases, the bodies of the less fortunate. Amid the bustling crowd, a small platform stood out, its edges adorned with the crude, flickering lights of a holographic sign that read in several languages exclusive merchandise rare and exotic. Beneath the sign, a figure was chained, her wrists bound by cruel iron cuffs that seemed almost too heavy for her slender arms to bear. She was a vision of otherworldly beauty, her skin a deep, shimmering blue that reflected the dying light of the suns like a pool of calm water in a sea of chaos. Zinnia stood motionless, her eyes downcast, her once proud posture now slumped in resignation. Her long, silver hair fell in tangled waves over her shoulders, partially obscuring her face, a face that bore the marks of endless suffering, yet still retained an ethereal elegance that set her apart from the other slaves displayed like cattle in the market. Her beauty was a cruel irony, a curse that had drawn countless eyes, not for admiration but for ownership. The crowd around her jeered and heckled, their voices a cacophony of crude jokes and offers. "I'll give you 10 credits for the blue one," a burly, tusked alien shouted, his voice thick with derision. "She looks like she's got some fight left in her." The trader standing next to Zinnia, a rotund, scaly-skinned creature with beady eyes, bared his sharp teeth in what passed for a smile. 10 credits? This one is worth far more than that, he hissed, his voice oily and grating. "Her kind is rare, practically extinct, they say. Strong, too. She'll fetch a much higher price from the right buyer." Zinnia barely registered the exchange, her mind dulled by exhaustion and despair. How many times had she heard similar conversations? How many times had she been appraised, sold, and passed from one cruel hand to another? Her once vibrant spirit had been all but extinguished, crushed under the weight of years of captivity and abuse. The memories of her home planet, once a place of peace and serenity, were now nothing but distant, painful echoes in her mind. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The crowd, sensing something, began to part, their attention drawn to a newcomer who was making his way through the throng. He moved with a quiet authority, his presence commanding respect without the need for words. Zinnia's dull eyes lifted slightly, curiosity piqued despite herself. The man who approached the platform was unlike anyone Zinnia had seen in this forsaken market. Tall and broad-shouldered, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had seen more of the galaxy than most could imagine. His features were sharp, his gaze intense, and yet there was a softness in his eyes that spoke of kindness, a rarity in this place. His clothes were practical, a mix of worn leather and sturdy fabric, built for travel and survival rather than fashion. As he reached the platform, the trader's obsequious grin faltered. There was something about this man that unsettled him, a quiet strength that made his usual bravado seem hollow. "Ah, a discerning customer, I see." The trader began, trying to regain his composure. "You have an eye for quality. This one here, she's a true gem, a rare find, worth every credit." The man didn't respond immediately. He studied Zinnia with a keen eye, not in the way the others had as an object to be owned but as a person. His gaze lingered on the shackles around her wrists, the bruises on her skin, the weariness in her posture. He could see the toll that years of captivity had taken on her, but he also saw something else, something that had not yet been completely extinguished. "What's her story?" he asked finally, his voice low and even. The trader hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "She's from a planet far from here. War-torn, ravaged by conflict. She's one of the last of her kind, or so they say. Strong, resilient, perfect for hard labor or other tasks." He let the implication hang in the air, trying to gauge the man's reaction. But the man didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he reached into a pouch at his side and pulled out a small metallic disc. He held it up, and the trader's eyes widened as the disc glowed faintly with a deep blue light. It was a high-value credit chip, worth more than most beings in the market would see in a lifetime. "I'll take her," the man said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. The trader's greed overrode his caution, and he quickly agreed, releasing Zinnia's chains with a flick of his wrist. As the cuffs fell away from her wrists, Xenia stumbled, her legs weak from standing in the same position for hours. The man caught her before she could fall, his grip firm but gentle. For a moment, Xenia met his eyes, those eyes that seemed so out of place in this harsh world. She searched for some hint of cruelty, some sign that this was just another exchange, another buyer who would treat her as nothing more than property. But all she found was a quiet compassion that made her heart ache with a longing she had not felt in years. "You're safe now," he said softly, his voice a balm to her battered soul. Safe. The word seemed almost foreign to her, a concept she had long since abandoned, but as she looked into his eyes she felt the faintest stirrings of something she had thought lost forever: hope. He guided her away from the platform, away from the jeers and the leering eyes of the crowd, towards a small, sleek spacecraft docked at the edge of the market. The ship was unassuming, but Xenia could sense that it was more than it appeared: a vessel built for both speed and durability, a refuge in the vast emptiness of space. As they boarded the ship, Xenia hesitated, a wave of uncertainty washing over her. What did this man want from her? Why had he saved her? The questions swirled in her mind, but she lacked the strength to voice them. Instead, she simply followed him, her steps unsteady but growing more assured with each passing moment. The interior of the ship was sparse but clean, a stark contrast to the filth and chaos of the marketplace. The man led her to a small cabin, outfitted with a simple bed and a storage unit. "You can rest here," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "We'll leave this place soon. You're free now, Xenia." Her name on his lips was like a lifeline, grounding her in a reality she could barely grasp. Free. Could it really be true? She sank onto the bed, her body trembling with exhaustion and disbelief. The man lingered at the doorway, as if sensing her need for space but also her fear of being alone. "Why," she finally whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. The man leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms as he considered her question. "Because no one deserves to live in chains," he replied, his voice steady. "And because you remind me of someone I lost a long time ago." Xenia looked up at him, searching his face for the truth behind his words. She could see the pain hidden beneath his calm exterior, the shadow of a past that still haunted him. In that moment she realized that they were not so different. Both of them were survivors, marked by loss and hardship but still clinging to a thread of hope. For the first time in years, Xenia allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for something better. She nodded slowly, her gratitude too deep for words, and the man gave her a small, reassuring smile before turning to leave. The stars stretched into infinite lines of light as the ship shot through the void, leaving the desolate market world far behind. The hum of the engines was a soothing constant, a reminder that each moment carried Xenia farther away from the place where she had been nothing more than a piece of merchandise. But even as the distance grew, the chains of her past still clung to her, invisible yet unbreakable. Xenia lay on the narrow bed in her small cabin, the cool metal walls pressing in around her. The cabin was simple, barely more than a cot, a storage compartment, and a small viewport through which she could see the stars streaking by. The man's words echoed in her mind: "You're free now." Xenia, she had turned those words over and over, trying to grasp their meaning, but freedom was an alien concept to her, something that seemed too fragile to trust. The man, her rescuer, had left her alone to rest, his presence a memory that lingered in the air. He had saved her, not just from the slaver's chains but from the hopelessness that had nearly consumed her. And yet, she couldn't help but wonder why. What did he see in her? What did he expect from her in return? Xenia rose from the bed, her limbs still aching from the long hours of standing in the marketplace. She approached the small viewport, her fingers brushing against the cold glass as she stared out at the endless expanse of space. The stars were distant and indifferent, twinkling in the void like the eyes of 1,000 silent witnesses. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft chime, signaling that someone was at the door. Xenia tensed instinctively, old fears flaring up, but then she remembered where she was. This ship was different, this man was different. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. "Come in," she said, her voice still carrying the weight of uncertainty. The door slid open with a quiet hiss, and the man stepped inside. He was no longer wearing the leather jacket he'd had on earlier, revealing a simple shirt beneath, its sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His movements were relaxed, casual, but Xenia could sense the careful control in every step he took, the way he held himself with a kind of restrained power. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said, his voice as gentle as it had been before. He glanced around the small cabin, his eyes briefly resting on the viewport before returning to her. "I just wanted to see how you were settling in." Xenia hesitated, unsure of how to respond. It had been so long since anyone had shown her genuine concern, and she found herself struggling to navigate this new terrain of kindness. "I'm fine," she replied, though the word felt inadequate. "Thank you for everything." He nodded, his expression softening. "There's no need to thank me, Xenia. You don't owe me anything." She looked down at her hands, twisting them together as if trying to find something to hold on to. But why, she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "Why did you help me? You could have just walked away." The man sighed, leaning against the wall with a thoughtful expression. "I didn't help you because I expected something in return," he said, his voice carrying a weight of sincerity. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. No one deserves to be treated like that, like a thing to be bought and sold." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Xenia felt a flicker of something in her chest, something that she hadn't felt in a long time. She looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of deception, but all she saw was an earnestness that was both disarming and comforting. "My name is Kale," by the way, he added after a moment, offering a small smile. "I figured it was about time we got properly introduced." Kale, Xenia repeated, the name unfamiliar but somehow fitting. She allowed herself a small smile in return, though it felt strange on her lips. "Thank you, Kale." He nodded again, pleased to see her relax even slightly. "We're heading to a small, uninhabited planet on the edge of the sector. It's a good place to rest and regroup. I thought it might be nice for you to spend some time somewhere peaceful." Peaceful, Xenia echoed, the word like a distant dream. "That sounds nice." Kale's smile widened slightly, a warmth in his eyes that made Xenia feel seen in a way she hadn't in years. "We'll be there soon. I thought maybe you'd like to join me in the cockpit. The view's pretty spectacular." Xenia hesitated for a moment, the idea of leaving the safety of the small cabin both thrilling and terrifying. But there was something about Kale, his quiet confidence, his unwavering kindness that made her want to trust him, to believe that perhaps not everyone in the galaxy was out to use her. "All right," she said finally, her voice steadier than before. "I'd like that." Kale stepped aside to let her pass, and together they made their way down the narrow corridor that led to the cockpit. The ship was small, but it was well maintained, the metal floors gleaming under the soft lights. Xenia could sense the care that had gone into keeping the vessel in good condition, and she found herself wondering what kind of life Kale led, alone in the vastness of space. The cockpit was a compact but functional space, with a wide viewport that offered a panoramic view of the stars. The control panels were neatly arranged, a mixture of analog and digital instruments that hummed quietly as the ship moved through the galaxy. Xenia's breath caught in her throat as she took in the sight an endless sea of stars, planets, and nebulae, all stretching out before them like a vast, uncharted wilderness. "It's beautiful," she whispered, almost afraid to break the spell. Kale smiled as he took his seat at the controls, gesturing for Xenia to sit in the co-pilot's chair. "It is," he agreed, his voice filled with a quiet reverence. "It's easy to forget, sometimes, just how beautiful the universe can be. Especially when you've been through what you've been through." Xenia settled into the chair, her gaze still fixed on the view outside. The stars seemed so close, as if she could reach out and touch them, and for a moment she allowed herself to forget the horrors of her past. Here, in the vastness of space, she felt small but also free, as if the weight of her past could be lifted away by the sheer magnitude of the cosmos. Kale watched her from the corner of his eye, sensing the shift in her demeanor. He had seen that look before, the awe, the wonder that came with seeing the universe in all its glory. It was a look he had once had himself, before life had worn him down. But seeing it in Xenia now, he felt a surge of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, she could find peace in this new life. "I've been traveling alone for a long time," Kale said after a while, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. "I never really had a destination in mind, just moving from place to place, trying to find something worth holding on to." Xenia turned to look at him, her curiosity piqued. "And did you find it?" He smiled, a little sadly. "Not yet. But I think I might be getting closer." There was something in his tone that resonated with Xenia, a shared sense of searching for something that had always seemed just out of reach. She understood the feeling all too well, the longing for something more, something that could fill the emptiness inside. I don't know what the future holds for us, Xenia Kale continued, his gaze fixed on the stars outside, but I do know that you're not alone anymore. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. Xenia felt a lump form in her throat at his words, a mix of gratitude and fear swirling in her chest. It was hard to believe that someone like Kale could care about her, that he could see her as more than just a broken survivor. But the sincerity in his voice, the way he spoke to her as an equal, made her want to believe it. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. I don't know how to repay you for what you've done." Kale shook his head, his expression serious. "You don't need to repay me, Xenia. You just need to live. To find your own way in this universe, free from the chains that held you down." His words were simple, but they struck a chord deep within her. Live. It seemed so straightforward, yet it was something she had almost forgotten how to do. She had been surviving for so long, clinging to life by sheer willpower, but truly living was something entirely different. For a long time they sat in silence, the stars their only companions. The ship moved steadily through the galaxy, its course set for a distant planet where they could rest and regroup. Xenia found herself growing more comfortable in Kale's presence, the initial tension between them easing into something resembling companionship. Eventually, Kale leaned forward, adjusting the ship's course with a practiced hand. "We're almost there," he said, a hint of anticipation in his voice. "This planet. It's one of my favorite places in the galaxy. No cities, no people, just nature, untouched and wild." Xenia felt a flicker of curiosity. "What made you choose this place?" Kale shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "Sometimes you just need a place where you can breathe, a place where you can forget about everything else, if only for a little while." Xenia nodded, understanding all too well. She had been holding her breath for so long, waiting for the next blow, the next betrayal. The idea of a place where she could simply exist, without fear or pain, was almost too much to hope for. As the planet came into view, Xenia leaned forward, her eyes widening in awe. It was a world of lush green forests, sparkling blue oceans, and towering mountains capped with snow. The planet was bathed in the light of a distant star, its surface shimmering with life and vitality. It was everything she had forgotten existed, a paradise, untouched by the horrors she had known. "It's beautiful," she whispered again, her voice filled with wonder. Kale smiled at her reaction, pleased to see the light in her eyes. "I thought you might like it. We'll stay here for a while, until you're ready to move on." Xenia felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sense of relief and hope that she hadn't felt in years. This place, this moment, it was the closest thing to peace she had known since she had been taken from her home. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to heal. As the ship descended towards the planet's surface, Xenia looked over at Kale, her heart full of gratitude and something more, a burgeoning sense of trust that she hadn't dared to feel in a long time. "Thank you, Kale," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. He met her gaze, his eyes filled with warmth and understanding. "You're welcome, Xenia. Welcome to your new life." As they touched down on the planet, the ship's engines powered down, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside. Xenia took a deep breath, the air sweet and clean, and for the first time in years, she felt something she thought she had lost forever: hope. The planet was like a forgotten gem, a pristine world untouched by the ravages of war and civilization. As Kale's ship settled gently onto a grassy plateau, Xenia felt the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the way the air seemed cleaner, lighter, filled with the scent of earth and growing things. The view from the cockpit was breathtaking, rolling hills blanketed in emerald green, ancient forests that stretched as far as the eye could see, and a distant mountain range capped with snow that gleamed in the soft light of the distant sun. Xenia could scarcely believe such a place existed. It was a stark contrast to the harsh, barren landscape she had grown accustomed to during her years of captivity. She had forgotten that worlds like this still existed, worlds where nature thrived in peace, untainted by the greed and violence that had shaped so much of her recent past. Kale powered down the ship's systems and leaned back in his seat, watching Xenia as she gazed out at the landscape with wide eyes. Her expression was a mixture of awe and disbelief, as if she couldn't quite trust what she was seeing. He didn't say anything, letting her take it all in at her own pace. He knew this moment was important, perhaps the first real moment of peace she'd experienced in a long time. After a long silence, Zinnia finally turned to Kale, her voice barely more than a whisper. Is this real? Kale smiled softly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. It's real, Zinnia. This place, it's as real as it gets. She nodded, still struggling to process the sheer beauty of the world before her. It felt like a dream, a fragile illusion that could shatter at any moment, but the warmth of the sun on her skin, the soft breeze that carried the scent of flowers through the open cockpit door, these were undeniable. They were real. We'll stay here for a while, Kale said, breaking the silence. There's no rush. This is a place to rest, to breathe. No one will find us here. The mention of safety, of being hidden from the galaxy's relentless grasp, brought a wave of relief that Zinnia hadn't expected. For so long she had been on the run, always looking over her shoulder, always expecting the worst. The idea that she could relax, even for a short time, was almost overwhelming. Thank you, she said again, the words feeling inadequate for the depth of her gratitude. But Kale seemed to understand, his smile reassuring and kind. Come on, he said, rising from his seat. Let's stretch our legs. There's something about walking on solid ground that makes everything feel a bit more real. Zinnia followed him, her movements hesitant but growing more assured as they made their way down the ramp and onto the soft grass. The moment her bare feet touched the ground, she felt a jolt of something powerful, a connection to the earth that grounded her in a way she hadn't felt in years. The grass was cool and soft beneath her toes, and the warmth of the sun on her face was a stark contrast to the cold metal floor she had grown used to. Kale watched her as she took her first tentative steps, his expression thoughtful. He could see the tension in her body slowly melting away, replaced by something more fragile, hope, perhaps, or the first stirrings of trust. He had seen this transformation before, in others who had been broken by the galaxy's cruelty, but Zinnia's journey felt different. There was something about her resilience, her quiet strength, that made him believe she could truly heal, given the time and space to do so. They walked in silence for a while, Kale leading them towards the edge of the plateau where the view opened up to reveal a sprawling valley below. A river wound its way through the landscape, its waters sparkling in the sunlight. Birds wheeled and dipped in the sky, their cries distant and hauntingly beautiful. Zinnia watched them, her heart swelling with a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite name. As they reached the edge of the plateau, Kale sat down on a flat rock and patted the space beside him. Zinnia hesitated for a moment before joining him, her movements still cautious, as if she feared breaking the spell of this peaceful place. For a long time they simply sat there, side by side, watching the world go by. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant rush of the river, and the occasional call of a bird. It was a symphony of life, a reminder that the galaxy was more than just violence and despair. Zinnia found herself relaxing, her shoulders slowly losing the tension that had been her constant companion for so long. The silence between her and Kale was comfortable, filled with a quiet understanding that didn't need words. It was a rare gift, this shared solitude, and she found herself grateful for it. After what felt like hours, Kale finally broke the silence, his voice gentle. Tell me about your home, Zinnia. What was it like? Zinnia stiffened at the question, her mind immediately retreating to the dark places where she had buried those memories. But something in Kale's tone, his genuine curiosity, his quiet patience, made her pause. He wasn't asking to pry, or to dredge up painful memories for his own sake. He was asking because he cared, because he wanted to understand her. It was, she faltered, struggling to find the words. It was beautiful, peaceful, nothing like this, but beautiful in its own way. Kale nodded, encouraging her to continue without pressure. We lived in harmony with the land, Zinnia said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. My people, we were connected to everything around us. The trees, the rivers, the mountains, they were all a part of us, and we were a part of us, and we were a part of them. We didn't take more than we needed, and we gave back whenever we could. She smiled faintly, remembering the vibrant forests of her home world, the way the leaves would shimmer in the light of her planet's twin moons. The nights were the most beautiful, she continued, her eyes distant as she spoke. The sky would light up with stars, so many that it felt like the whole universe was watching over us. And the air, it was filled with the scent of flowers that only bloomed at night. It was magical. Kale listened intently, his heart aching at the sadness in her voice. He could hear the loss in her words, the pain of being torn away from a place that had been more than just a home. It had been her sanctuary, her connection to something greater, and now it was gone. What happened? He asked gently, though he already knew the answer. Xenia's expression darkened, her gaze dropping to the ground. They came for us, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Invaders. They wanted our resources, our land. They didn't care about us, they saw us as obstacles, something to be removed. She swallowed hard, the memories flooding back with painful clarity. We tried to fight, but we were no match for their weapons. They destroyed everything: our cities, our forests, our people, my family. Her voice cracked, and she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I lost them. I lost everything. Kale reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder in a gesture of comfort. I'm sorry, Xenia, he said softly. I can't imagine what that must have been like. She nodded, blinking back tears. I was taken by the slavers after that, she continued, her voice shaking. They sold me from one master to another, each one worse than the last. I lost myself in those years. I forgot what it meant to be free, to have a purpose. All I knew was pain. Kale's grip on her shoulder tightened, a silent promise of support. But you're not there anymore, he said firmly. You're here, now. You're free. Xenia looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and fear. But what does that mean, she asked, her voice trembling. I don't know how to be free anymore. I don't know who I am without those chains. Kale sighed, his expression thoughtful. Freedom isn't just about being able to do what you want, he said slowly. It's about finding your own path, deciding who you want to be. And that takes time, Xenia. It's not something you have to figure out all at once. She considered his words, her mind turning them over like a puzzle. But what if I don't know where to start, she asked, her voice small. Kale smiled gently. You start by living, he said simply. By experiencing the world around you, by finding out what brings you joy, what makes you feel alive. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But you're not alone in this. I'm here, and I'll help you in any way I can. Xenia felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, a small flame of hope flickering to life. She had spent so long in darkness, in fear, that the idea of finding joy again seemed almost impossible. But as she looked out at the peaceful valley below, at the world that seemed so full of life and possibility, she felt something shift inside her. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to live again. Thank you, Kale, she said quietly, her voice filled with sincerity. I don't know how to repay you for everything you've done. Kale shook his head, his smile soft. You don't need to repay me, Xenia. Just live. That's all I want for you. They sat there for a long time, watching the sun dip lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the landscape. Xenia felt a sense of peace settle over her, a quiet acceptance of the fact that her past, as painful as it was, did not have to define her future. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Kale stood and offered her his hand. Come on, he said with a smile. Let's set up camp. There's a lot more to see tomorrow. Xenia took his hand, allowing him to pull her to her feet. She felt a new sense of resolve growing within her, a determination to move forward, to find out who she could be in this new life Kale had given her. As they walked back to the ship to gather their supplies, Xenia glanced up at the sky, where the stars were beginning to shine. For the first time in years, they reminded her of home, not in a way that filled her with pain, but with a sense of connection to something greater, something that could never be taken from her. She was still far from healed, far from understanding what her future might hold, but for the first time she felt ready to take that first step into the unknown. And with Kale by her side, she knew she wouldn't have to face it alone. The days on the serene planet drifted by like a dream, each one blending seamlessly into the next. For Xenia, the peace was both a balm and a challenge. Every morning she woke to the gentle sounds of the forest, the birds singing in the trees, and the whisper of the wind through the leaves. The air was sweet and filled with the scents of flowers and earth, a constant reminder of the life that thrived all around her. Kale kept his promise to give her space and time. They spent their days exploring the planet, hiking through the dense forests, swimming in crystal-clear lakes, and sitting by the river that wound its way through the valley. Kale showed her how to fish, how to identify edible plants, and how to start a fire without the need for technology. Each new skill she learned was a step towards reclaiming her independence, a small victory in her journey to rediscover who she was. But as much as the planet provided solace, it also gave her time to think, too much time, perhaps. In the quiet moments when Kale was busy with tasks around their camp, or when she was alone with her thoughts, the memories would return, unbidden and relentless. The horrors she had endured, the faces of those she had lost, and the ever-present guilt of having survived when so many others had not, all these ghosts haunted her, refusing to let her fully embrace the peace she so desperately craved. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Zinnia sat by the river, her feet dangling in the cool water. Kale had gone to gather firewood, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She stared at the water, watching the way it rippled and flowed, so different from the stagnant existence she had known for so long. But tonight the peaceful surroundings did little to calm her mind. The shadows were growing longer, and with them came the darkness she feared most, the darkness within her own soul. Xania clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she tried to push the memories away. But they came flooding back with a vengeance, visions of her family, their faces contorted in fear and pain as their world was torn apart. The screams, the smoke, the relentless march of the invaders as they destroyed everything she had ever known. And then, the cold, unfeeling faces of the slavers who had taken her, treated her like an object, sold her to the highest bidder without a second thought. She had tried so hard to forget, to move on, but the memories clung to her like a second skin. No matter how far she ran, they were always there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to drag her back into the abyss. She didn't hear Kale approach until he was standing right beside her. He moved so quietly, as if he knew she needed space, yet didn't want her to feel alone. "Xania," he said softly, his voice full of concern. "Are you all right?" Xania didn't answer immediately. She was too lost in her own mind, too consumed by the guilt and the pain that had become such a part of her. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "How can I be all right?" she asked, her tone bitter and self-loathing. "After everything that's happened, how can I ever be all right again?" Kale crouched down beside her, his eyes filled with empathy. He didn't try to offer false comfort or empty platitudes. Instead, he simply listened, giving her the space to express what she had been holding inside for so long. "I lost everything," Xania continued, her voice shaking with emotion. "My home, my family, my freedom. I don't even know who I am anymore. All I have are these memories, these nightmares that won't let me go. And no matter how hard I try to move on, they keep pulling me back. I'm so tired, Kale. I'm so tired of fighting." Kale's heart ached at her words. He could see the depth of her pain, the weight of the burden she carried. He wanted to help her, to take away her suffering, but he knew that this was a battle she had to face on her own terms. "You've been through more than anyone should ever have to endure," he said gently. "But you're still here, Xania. You're still fighting, even if it doesn't feel like it. That takes an incredible amount of strength." Xenia shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "But what if I'm not strong enough? What if? What if I can't ever get past this? What if I never learn how to live again?" Kale reached out, taking her hands in his. His grip was firm but comforting, a lifeline in the storm of her emotions. "You don't have to do this alone," he said softly. "I'm here with you, every step of the way, and we'll face whatever comes together." For a long moment, Xenia didn't respond. She stared down at their joined hands, feeling the warmth of his skin against hers. It was a small comfort, but it was enough to keep her grounded, to keep her from slipping back into the darkness. Finally, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "What if I never find peace, Kale? What if I never stop feeling this way?" Kale's expression softened, and he gently squeezed her hands. "Finding peace isn't something that happens overnight," he said. "It's a journey, one that takes time and patience. There will be setbacks, and there will be moments when it feels like you're not making any progress. But the fact that you're still here, still trying, that's what matters." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "And as for the pain, it may never fully go away, but it can become something you live with, something that doesn't control you. It can become a part of who you are without defining you." Xenia took a deep, shaky breath, trying to absorb what he was saying. It was difficult to believe, difficult to imagine a life where the pain didn't dominate every waking moment. But Kale's words offered a glimmer of hope, a small light in the darkness. I want to believe that, she said quietly. I want to believe that I can move on. Kale smiled, a small but genuine expression of encouragement. You can, Xenia, and you will. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick. But you're not alone in this. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. The sincerity in his voice, the unwavering support in his eyes made Xenia feel something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of safety, of being cared for. It was a strange and unfamiliar feeling, but it was one she desperately needed. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Kale nodded, his smile widening slightly. You don't have to thank me, Xenia. Just promise me you'll keep fighting no matter how hard it gets. Xenia looked at him, seeing the depth of his compassion, his unwavering belief in her. It was more than she could have ever hoped for, more than she believed she deserved. But for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of determination, a desire to prove to herself that she could be more than her past. I promise, she said, her voice steadier now. Kale released her hands and stood, offering her a hand to help her up. She took it, feeling a new strength in her grip, a small but significant step towards reclaiming herself. Let's get back to camp, Cal said, his tone lighter now. I have a feeling you're going to need a good meal after all this. Xenia managed a small smile, appreciating the way he shifted the conversation, giving her space to breathe. You're probably right, she said, her voice tinged with a hint of humor. As they walked back to camp, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a deep blue twilight. The stars began to appear, one by one, twinkling in the sky like distant beacons. Xenia glanced up at them, feeling a sense of connection to something greater, something that transcended her pain and loss. But as they neared the camp, Xenia's senses prickled with unease. Something was off, something that disrupted the peaceful atmosphere of the planet. She slowed her pace, her instincts on high alert, scanning the area for any sign of danger. Kale noticed her sudden tension and followed her gaze. What is it, he asked, his voice low and cautious. Xenia didn't answer immediately. She stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she focused on a shadowy figure lurking near their camp. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Xenia's years of captivity had honed her senses to detect the smallest threat. Someone's here, she whispered, her voice tight with fear and anger. Kale's expression darkened, and he reached for the blaster he always kept holstered at his side. Stay behind me, he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. But Xenia shook her head, the fear in her eyes quickly turning to determination. No, I won't hide, not anymore. Kale glanced at her, seeing the resolve in her expression. He nodded, respecting her choice. All right, but stay close. Together, they approached the camp, their steps slow and deliberate. The figure remained still, as if waiting for them, and as they drew closer, Xenia's heart sank as recognition set in. The figure stepped out of the shadows, revealing a tall, imposing man with a cruel smile and eyes that gleamed with malice. He was dressed in dark, worn clothing, his face scarred and weathered by a life of violence. But it was his eyes that Xenia recognized, cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of compassion. Well, the man said, his voice a low, mocking drawl. If it isn't the little blue slave. Been a long time, hasn't it, sweetheart? Xenia's blood ran cold. This man was one of her former masters, one of the most ruthless and sadistic of them all. He had been the one to break her spirit, to push her to the brink of despair. And now he was standing right in front of her, as if her nightmares had come to life. Kale stepped forward, his blaster aimed at the man's chest. I don't know who you are, he said coldly, but you're not welcome here. Leave now, or I won't hesitate to shoot. The man laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that sent chills down Xenia's spine. Oh, I'm not here for you, friend, he sneered. I'm here for her. She belongs to me, and I'm taking her back. Xenia's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of fear and anger swirling inside her. She had spent so long running from her past, so long trying to forget the pain this man had caused her. But now he was here, threatening to drag her back into the darkness she had fought so hard to escape. But as she looked at Kale, at the strength and determination in his eyes, something shifted inside her. She was no longer the broken, terrified slave this man had once known. She was Xenia, and she had found something worth fighting for. No, she said, her voice firm and steady. You don't own me anymore. I'm not your slave, and I never will be again. The man's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. You've grown a spine, I see, he said, his tone filled with disdain. But that doesn't change the fact that you're mine. I paid good money for you, and I'm not letting you go. Cale stepped closer, his blaster still trained on the man. You're not taking her anywhere, he said coldly. Now I suggest you leave before things get ugly. The man glanced between Xenia and Cale, his expression calculating. You really think you can protect her, he sneered. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Cale's gaze hardened. Try me. For a moment the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Xenia's heart raced as she watched the standoff, knowing that any second could be the moment when everything changed. But she refused to back down, refused to let this man take away the life she was beginning to build. Finally the man took a step back, his smile returning, but this time with a sinister edge. You may have won this round, he said, his voice dripping with venom. But this isn't over. I'll be back for what's mine. And when I do, you won't be able to stop me. With that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, his presence leaving a dark cloud over the peaceful camp. Cale lowered his blaster, his expression grim as he watched the man leave. Are you all right, he asked, turning to Xenia. She nodded, though her heart was still pounding. I'm fine, she said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her fear. But he's right, this isn't over. Cale sighed, his expression filled with concern. We'll deal with it when the time comes, he said firmly. But for now, you're safe, and we'll make sure it stays that way. Xenia looked at him, seeing the determination in his eyes, the promise that he would protect her no matter what. It was a comfort, but it also reminded her that she couldn't rely on him to fight her battles for her. She had to find her own strength, her own way to face the darkness that still loomed over her. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice filled with gratitude. But I won't let him take me. Not again. Cale nodded, respect shining in his eyes. I know you won't, Xenia. You're stronger than you think. As they returned to camp, Xenia couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in her chest. The past had found her, and it wouldn't be so easily left behind. But as she sat by the fire that night, Cale beside her, she felt a new resolve growing within her. She wasn't the same person she had been before. She had been through hell and survived, and now she was ready to fight for the life she wanted, the life she deserved. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she wouldn't face them alone. The planet that had once been a sanctuary now felt like a battleground. The encounter with Xenia's former master hung over the camp like a dark cloud, a constant reminder that her past was never truly gone, just waiting to rear its ugly head. The peace they had found here, so fragile and precious, was now tainted with the fear of what was to come. Xenia's sleep was plagued by nightmares. The faces of her family, twisted in agony, merged with the cruel eyes of her captors. She would wake in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, the echoes of her past refusing to let her rest. Each morning she would rise, more exhausted than the day before, the weight of her memories and the looming threat pressing down on her. Cale noticed the change in her, the way her shoulders sagged with weariness, the dark circles under her eyes. He tried to help, offering comfort and reassurance, but Xenia withdrew into herself, the fear and anger she felt too overwhelming to share. She didn't want to burden him, didn't want him to see how close she was to breaking. But Cale was not easily deterred. He stayed by her side, refusing to let her face her demons alone. They spent their days preparing for the inevitable, training together, honing their skills, and fortifying their camp. Cale showed Xenia how to handle a blaster, how to defend herself in close combat. He was patient, understanding that this was more than just physical training for her. It was a way to reclaim her power, to prove to herself that she was not the helpless victim she had been made to feel. Xenia threw herself into the training with a determination that bordered on desperation. Each punch, each shot fired, was an outlet for the anger and fear that churned inside her. She pushed herself to the brink of exhaustion, as if by punishing her body, she could silence the turmoil in her mind. But no matter how hard she fought, the memories clung to her, a constant reminder of the horrors she had endured. Cale watched her struggle, his heart aching for her. He admired her strength, her resilience, but he also saw the toll it was taking on her. He knew that this battle was as much mental as it was physical, and he worried that she was pushing herself too hard, that she would break under the strain. One evening, after a particularly grueling training session, Cale decided it was time to talk. They were sitting by the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows on the trees around them. The air was cool, the stars just beginning to peek out from the darkening sky. Xenia was silent, staring into the fire, her hands clenched into fists, as if she was still fighting some unseen enemy. Xenia Kale began gently, his voice low and calm. "We need to talk." She didn't look at him, her eyes fixed on the flames. "About what?" she asked, her voice flat and weary. "About you," Kale said, watching her closely. "You've been pushing yourself hard, too hard. I'm worried about you." Xenia's jaw tightened, a flash of anger crossing her face. "I'm fine," she said, her tone clipped. "I need to be ready. I need to be strong." Kale shook his head, his expression filled with concern. "You are strong, Xenia, but you're also human, or at least close enough," he added with a small smile, trying to lighten the mood. "You need to rest, to take care of yourself. Pushing yourself to the brink won't help when the time comes." She finally looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and vulnerability. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "If I'm not strong enough, he'll take me again. And I can't. I can't go back to that. I'd rather die." Kale's heart ached at her words, at the pain and fear behind them. He reached out, taking her hand in his touch warm and reassuring. "Xenia, you're not alone in this," he said softly. "I'm here, and I won't let him take you. But you can't fight this battle by wearing yourself down. You need to be at your best, and that means taking care of yourself." Xenia looked down at their joined hands, her mind racing. She knew he was right, but the fear was so overwhelming, so all-consuming, that she didn't know how to stop. She was terrified of letting her guard down, of being weak, of being vulnerable again. "I don't know how to stop," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Every time I close my eyes, I see him. I see him. I see what he did to me, what he could do again. How do I make it go away?" Kale squeezed her hand gently, his voice filled with compassion. "You can't make it go away, Xenia, but you can learn to live with it. It's not about forgetting or pretending it never happened. It's about finding a way to move forward, to take back control of your life." She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I'm scared, Kale," she whispered. "I'm so scared." Kale felt his own eyes sting with unshed tears, his heart breaking for her. "I know," he said softly, "but you don't have to face this alone. We'll get through this together, I promise." Xenia nodded, leaning into him, letting his strength bolster her. For a long time they sat like that, the fire crackling softly, the stars twinkling above them. Kale held her close, his presence a comforting anchor in the storm of her emotions. As the night wore on, the temperature dropped and Kale suggested they get some rest. Xenia agreed, though she knew sleep would not come easily. But tonight she didn't want to be alone. She needed to feel Kale's warmth, his presence beside her, to remind her that she wasn't fighting this battle alone. They made their way to the small tent they had set up near the campfire, and without a word, Kale wrapped a blanket around Xenia's shoulders, pulling her close. She hesitated for a moment, then relaxed into his embrace, finding comfort in his steady heartbeat, in the warmth of his arms around her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude and something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. It was a fragile emotion, one she was afraid to name, but it was there, growing stronger with each passing day. Kale smiled against her hair, his voice soft and reassuring. "You don't have to thank me, Xenia. I'm just glad you're here." For the first time in what felt like forever, Xenia allowed herself to relax, to let go of the fear, if only for a little while. She felt safe in Kale's arms, safe enough to close her eyes and let sleep claim her. And as she drifted off, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with Kale by her side. But the peace was short-lived. The next morning they awoke to the sound of rustling leaves and the snap of a twig. Xenia was instantly alert, her hand reaching for the blaster Kale had given her. She shared a tense look with Kale, who was already on his feet, his blaster drawn. "Stay close," Kale whispered, his eyes scanning the trees around them. Xenia nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. The fear she had fought so hard to keep at bay surged back with a vengeance, but she forced herself to stay calm, to focus. She wasn't the helpless girl she had been before. She was stronger now, and she wouldn't go down without a fight. They moved cautiously through the forest, every sound amplified by the tension in the air. Xenia's senses were on high alert, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch setting her nerves on edge. But she stayed close to Kale, her blaster held steady in her hands, ready for whatever or whoever might be out there. Then they saw a figure moving through the trees, trying to stay hidden, but not quite succeeding. Xenia's heart skipped a beat, her grip tightening on the blaster. She knew that shape, that gait, it was him. Her former master had found her again. Kale saw him too, his expression hardening. He motioned for Xenia to stay back, but she shook her head, stepping forward. She wasn't going to hide this time. She was going to face him, to show him that she wasn't the same broken slave he had once known. As they approached, the figure stopped, turning to face them. The man's face was twisted in a sneer, his eyes gleaming with malice. "I told you I'd be back," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You didn't really think you could escape me, did you, sweetheart?" Xenia's blood ran cold, but she forced herself to stand tall, to meet his gaze without flinching. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her heart. "You don't own me anymore." The man's sneer widened, a cruel laugh escaping his lips. "We'll see about that," he said, his hand moving to the weapon at his side. Before he could draw it, Kale fired a warning shot at his feet, making the man jump back in surprise. "Don't," Kale warned, his voice deadly calm. "You take one more step, and it'll be your last." The man's eyes narrowed, his hand hovering over his weapon. "You think you can protect her," he spat. "She's mine. She always will be." Xenia's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of fear and rage swirling inside her. She had spent so long running from this man, so long fearing him, but now, standing here with Kale by her side, she realized something she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of him. Not of what he could do to her. She stepped forward, her blaster trained on the man's chest. "I'm not yours," she said, her voice filled with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. "I never was, and I never will be." The man sneered, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "You think you're strong now," he taunted. "You think this man can save you? You're nothing without me, nothing but a scared little girl." Xenia felt the words sting, the memories of her past clawing at her, but she didn't let them take hold. She wasn't that scared little girl anymore. She was Xenia, and she had survived. She had fought her way out of the darkness, and she wasn't going to let this man drag her back down. "Maybe I was scared," she admitted, her voice steady. "Maybe I was weak, but not anymore. You don't control me, and you never will." The man's sneer faded, replaced by a look of pure hatred. "You'll regret this," he snarled, his hand moving to his weapon again. But before he could draw it, Xenia fired, the shot hitting the ground just inches from his feet. "I said you don't control me," she repeated, her voice like steel. "Now, get out of here, and don't ever come near me again." The man hesitated, his eyes darting between Xenia and Kale. He could see the determination in their eyes, the strength that he had never expected to find in Xenia. He realized too late that she was no longer the broken slave he had once known. She was something else entirely, something stronger, something he couldn't control. With a final snarl, he turned and disappeared into the trees, his retreating figure soon swallowed by the forest. Xenia stood there, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. She had done it, she had faced him, and she had won. But the victory felt hollow, the fear still lingering in her chest, the memories still haunting her. Kale was by her side in an instant, his hand on her shoulder, his eyes filled with concern. "Xenia, are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft. She nodded, though she wasn't sure if she was all right. She felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion, the adrenaline leaving her body in a rush, leaving her feeling weak and shaky. "I think so," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't think I could do that." Kale smiled, his hand squeezing her shoulder gently. "You were amazing," he said, his voice filled with pride. "You stood up to him, Xenia. You didn't let him win." Xenia looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. "I couldn't have done it without you," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave me the strength to fight back." Kale shook his head, his smile soft and warm. "You had that strength all along, Xenia. I just helped you find it." She felt a tear slip down her cheek, but this time it wasn't a tear of sadness or fear, it was a tear of relief, of gratitude, of hope. She had faced her past, and though the battle wasn't over, she knew she was no longer the helpless girl she had once been. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with all the emotion she couldn't put into words. Kale pulled her into a hug, his arms strong and comforting around her. "You don't have to thank me," he said softly. "I'm just glad you're safe." They stood there for a long time holding each other, the tension of the encounter slowly melting away. Zinnia felt the fear recede, replaced by a sense of calm, of peace. She wasn't out of the woods yet, but she knew now that she could face whatever came her way. She had Kale by her side, and more importantly, she had found the strength within herself to fight back. As they made their way back to the camp, Zinnia felt a new sense of resolve growing within her. She was done running, done hiding from her past. She was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, ready to reclaim her life and her future. And with Kale by her side, she knew she could do it. The ship hummed quietly as it orbited the planet below, a world that had once been Xania's home. Now, it was a place of painful memories and unanswered questions, but this journey wasn't just about the physical return to her home. It was about confronting the deepest fears and insecurities that had haunted her since the day she was taken. Xania stood in the small living quarters of the ship, her gaze fixed on the stars outside the viewport. She could see the planet below, the scars of war etched into its surface like open wounds. The once lush forests and serene landscapes were now marred by destruction, a stark reminder of everything she had lost. But as much as the sight of her ravaged home pained her, it was not the source of the turmoil churning inside her. That lay in the quiet moments she spent with Kale, in the way he looked at her with kindness and respect, in the way he treated her as an equal, not as an object or a burden. It was in those moments that Zinnia felt the weight of her own self-doubt pressing down on her, a suffocating fear that she was unworthy of the love and care he offered so freely. Kale had given her so much his protection, his companionship, his unwavering support. He had saved her not just from her captors but from the darkness within herself. And yet, as much as she had come to care for him, to rely on him, there was a part of her that couldn't shake the belief that she didn't deserve any of it. The years of pain and loss had left her scarred in ways that went beyond the physical, and the idea of being loved for who she was, not for what she could do or how she looked, was something she struggled to accept. Xania turned away from the viewport, her mind racing with thoughts she had tried to push aside for days, maybe even weeks. She had convinced herself that she could ignore the gnawing insecurity, that she could bury it deep inside and focus on the future she wanted to build with Kale. But as they had drawn closer to her home planet, the emotions she had kept at bay began to rise to the surface, impossible to ignore. She had seen too much cruelty, had been treated as little more than property for so long that the idea of being with someone who truly valued her as an equal seemed like a distant dream. She couldn't shake the fear that she wasn't enough, that she would somehow fail him, that he would see her as weak, damaged, unworthy of the life he offered. And so, in the quiet of the ship, with only the stars as witnesses, Xania made a decision. It was a decision born of desperation and a deep-seated belief that the only way she could stay by Kale's side was by offering herself in the only way she knew, how as a servant. She had seen too much cruelty to believe she could be anything more. With a deep breath, Xania left the living quarters and made her way to the cockpit, where Kale sat, his gaze focused on the controls. The soft glow of the instrument panels cast a warm light across his features, and for a moment Xania hesitated, her resolve wavering. But the fear, the belief that she didn't deserve more, pushed her forward. "Kale," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Kale turned to her, a smile touching his lips as he saw her standing there. "Xania," he said warmly, "come here. We're almost ready to land." Xania shook her head, her heart pounding in her chest. "No, Kale, I need to talk to you." Something in her tone made Kale's smile fade, concern flickering in his eyes. He turned in his seat to face her fully, his expression serious. "What is it?" he asked, his voice filled with a quiet concern. Xenia swallowed hard, her hands trembling at her sides. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice unsteady. "About everything you've done for me, about us." Kale's brow furrowed, his concern growing. "Xenia, you don't have to." "Please, let me finish," Xania interrupted, her voice trembling with the weight of what she was about to say. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "You've given me so much, Kale. You saved me, you've taken care of me, you've shown me kindness when I didn't think I deserved it. And I don't know how to repay you." Kale opened his mouth to speak, but Xania pressed on, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm not like you, Kale. I'm not strong, I'm not whole. I'm broken, and I've seen too much, done too much. I'm not worthy of the life you've offered me. Kale's eyes softened, and he reached out to take her hand, but Xenia pulled back, a pained look on her face. Please, she whispered, her voice cracking. I've thought about this, and it's the only way I know how to stay by your side. Kale's heart sank at the desperation in her voice, but he remained silent, waiting for her to continue. Xenia closed her eyes, willing herself to say the words that had been tormenting her. Let me be your personal slave, she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. It's all I know, Kale. It's the only way I can repay you, the only way I can be with you without feeling like I'm a burden. Kale felt a surge of emotions, shock, sadness, anger, not at Xenia, but at the world that had made her feel this way, that had reduced her to believing that she was worth nothing more than servitude. He stood, crossing the small space between them in an instant, and gently took her hands in his. Xenia, he said, his voice filled with emotion, look at me. She hesitated, her eyes still closed, but Kale's gentle insistence made her slowly lift her gaze to meet his. The pain in her eyes cut him to the core, but he forced himself to speak, to say the words she needed to hear. You are not a slave, he said firmly, his grip on her hands tightening just slightly. You never were, and you never will be. Not to me, not to anyone. Xenia's breath hitched, tears welling in her eyes as she shook her head. But I don't know how to be anything else, she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know how to be someone who deserves to be loved. Kale's heart ached at her words, at the raw vulnerability she was showing him. He released her hands and cupped her face gently, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had begun to fall. Xenia, he said softly, you deserve so much more than you've been given. You deserve to be loved, to be treated with kindness and respect, not because of what you can offer, but because of who you are. She shook her head again, her tears falling freely now. I'm broken, Kale. I'm not whole. How can you love someone like me? Kale's gaze softened, and he leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers. You're not broken, Xenia, he whispered. You've been hurt, you've been scarred, but you're not broken. You're strong, you're resilient, and you're worth more than you know. Xenia sobbed, her body trembling as she leaned into Kale's embrace, her heart aching with the weight of her emotions. I don't know how to believe that, she admitted, her voice muffled against his chest. Kale held her close, his arms wrapped around her protectively. Then let me believe it for you, he said softly. Let me show you every day that you are worthy of love, of happiness. Let me be your partner, not your master. Xenia clung to him, her tears soaking into his shirt, but she didn't care. She had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed, but Kale's words, his touch, were like a balm to her wounded soul. She didn't know if she could ever see herself the way he saw her, but for the first time she felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could learn. Kale pulled back slightly, just enough to look into her eyes, his expression gentle but serious. I don't want a slave, Xenia, he said firmly. I want you. I want you as my partner, my equal. We've been through so much together, and I want to build a life with you, a life where we can both heal, where we can both find happiness. But I can't do that if you don't see your own worth. Xenia sniffled, her tears slowing as she looked up at him, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and something else, something that felt a lot like love. I want that too, she whispered. But I'm scared, Kale. I'm scared that I'll never be enough. Kale smiled softly, his eyes shining with emotion. You are enough, Xenia, he said gently. You've always been enough. And I'll be here, every step of the way, to remind you of that. We'll do this together, as equals, as partners. Xenia took a deep, shaky breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent so long believing that she was only worth what she could offer, that she was nothing more than a slave, a servant. But here, in Kale's arms, with his words echoing in her mind, she began to see a glimmer of a different future, a future where she was valued for who she was, not for what she could do. Okay, she whispered, her voice filled with a tentative hope. Kale's smile widened, and he pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. That's all I ask, he said softly. We'll take it one day at a time. Xenia nodded, her heart feeling lighter than it had in years. The road ahead was still uncertain, still filled with challenges, but for the first time she felt like she wasn't facing it alone. She had Kale by her side, and together they would find a way to build the life they both. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's embrace, the ship continued its journey, the stars outside the viewport a silent witness to the promise they had made to each other. It wasn't the end of their journey, but the beginning of something new, something filled with hope, with love, and with the promise of a future where they could both find peace and happiness. And for the first time in years, Xenia felt like she could truly believe in that future.